So NIO just released their third quarter earnings for 2018. By the way, NIO is the Chinese electric vehicle maker, and investor reactions to their earnings have been pretty divided. But I actually think that they're not too bad. So we're going to go through all the numbers and I'll give my opinion as we go through it all. Let's get started. What's up, everybody? My name is Ala and welcome to my world of stocks. Just for full disclosure, I do have a very small speculative position in NIO that I plan on holding very long term in hopes that they eventually become a much more stable and hopefully profitable company in the future. But if you've never heard of NIO, they are an electric vehicle company with very similar ambitions to something like Tesla, but they're actually based in China. And I actually did a very thorough video review on their company and their stock, which you can find up here, down below, or at the end of this video on a clickable card. Now, because NIO is based in China, some would point to that as an advantage for NIO because of things like cheap labor and the fact that China happens to be the largest electric vehicle market in the world. In fact, last year, China sold close to half of all electric vehicles in the world and almost triple its next closest competitor, which was the United States. And according to J.D. Power, that market is estimated to grow by another 40% in the next couple of years, with China aiming for over 2 million in sales of electric vehicles and hybrids by 2020. But on the flip side of that coin, many bears would argue that NIO has not really proven themselves, that they are not profitable, that they continue to burn through their cash, that they don't have anywhere near the same capacity of something like Tesla, and that they will continuously see increased competition in China because that is a growing market where competition will just keep popping up for them. Now, I'll address most of those issues at the end of the video. I'll give an overall conclusion and how I feel about everything. But let me just start by saying that NIO barely IPO'd just a couple months ago, back in September, for $6.26. They climbed as high as $14 a share shortly after that, but have since crashed right back down to reality at around $6 or $7 per share. I usually see them hanging out around that price. Now, in terms of their first commercial electric vehicle that is, sold to the public, that is their 7-seater SUV. It's called the ES8, and they barely started shipping units back in at the end of June, which was actually the last 3 days of June. They shipped 100 units of those, and that also accounts for their second quarter. I know it sounds a little weird, but I have to give you guys context because we're going to be looking at their third quarter earnings, and so just know that their second quarter was only really the last 3 days of June. So all numbers in their third quarter is going to look really high, and it's going to look kind of outrageous, but it's because their second quarter was only really the last 3 days of June. That's really when they just barely started to ship out their commercial vehicle. Okay, but let's go ahead and start by looking at all of their earnings numbers. Now, starting with revenue, that came in at 1.5 billion yuan. That is, in other words, that's the Chinese currency. It's also known as RMB or renminbi, which I'm sure I'm pronouncing wrong, but I usually just say yuan. So they announced, they came out with 1.5 billion yuan in revenue, and this was an increase quarter over quarter of over 3,000%. So again, remember, because their second quarter was so short, you're going to see some really high numbers here. So revenue increased by over 3,000%. Now, their gross margin came in at negative 7.9%, which I was actually expecting it to be a little worse. So I don't think it was that bad in my opinion. And that, of course, is an improvement of almost 100%. Because their last quarter, their margin was at negative 333%. Okay, so those are somewhat of the pros, but now let's take a look at what all the bears are talking about. So net loss came in at negative 2.8 billion yuan, a quarter over quarter increase of 56%, with loss from operations at negative 2.8 billion at an increase of 50%. And basically their EPS was at negative 42.59, but that did improve by about 80% quarter over quarter. Okay, now I know that those numbers sound really bad, but we have to provide some context here. This is literally from their investor relations page. A big chunk of their operating expenses was due to promotional events for their ES8. So in other words, they were trying to gain recognition through marketing and setting up free test drive events, things like that, but mainly because the development costs related to their smaller ES6 SUV, which we'll talk about later, and shared-based compensation expenses related to stock options because of their IPO. So in other words, a lot of those expenses are likely to not be recurring expenses. In other words, we shouldn't really see many of those going forward. In fact, if we adjust for those sort of one-time expenses, then the numbers actually get much better. In fact, when looking at their loss from operations, that shrinks from 50% to 31% quarter over quarter, and net loss shrinks from 56% to 37%, and their EPS also improves from -42 to -10, with an 82% improvement quarter over quarter. So still pretty bad numbers, but as long as we can kind of avoid those one-time expenses, or at least improve upon them, then going forward we should see better numbers. Okay, now before we look at guidance for the next quarter, and before I finish up by giving my overall opinion, we're going to take a look at their vehicle sales. So looking at the ES8, this is their 7-seater SUV. Now remember that they only produced 500 and sold only 100 of them last quarter. So this quarter they obviously had a massive improvement, jumping from 500 produced last quarter to 4,206 produced this quarter, and jumping from 100 sold last quarter to 3,268 sold this quarter, both figures representing a quarter over quarter increase of 741% and 3,168% respectively. And if we take a little bit of a closer look and take a look at their sales month by month, we jump from 100 in June to 381 in July to 1,121 in August to 1,766 in September, and then that number actually drops in October to only 1,573, but that's because the Chinese have a week-long holiday in October in which vehicle registration offices are closed. So if we take the 31 days of October and subtract that by 7, we get 24. And if we divide that 24 into the 1,573 units, we get an average of 65.5 per day. So then we multiply that by 7 and we get an average of 459 per week. And then we add that missing week to the total and we actually get over 2,030 units for the month of October. So that's a much more realistic number for that month, and it actually shows that deliveries continue to increase at a very nice pace. Now that puts our actual raw total at around 4,941 so far. And that leaves November and December to make up the rest. Now, when I say the rest, NIO is guiding for 10,000 ES8s to be sold this year. So by the end of this year, we've got November and December to make up around 5,000 more in sales. And I think it's very important that NIO hits that target. We've learned this lesson many times with many similar kind of stocks where when they guide for specific unit sales, if they hit those, it can sometimes really help the stock. If they miss those, it can sometimes really hurt the stock. But the good news is that I think they can easily hit these targets. Now, that's just my opinion, but I think they will destroy that target because that leaves November and December to get about 2,500 in each month to get the total of around 5,000 that they need. And at the rate that they're increasing production and deliveries, that should be no problem. They'll probably surpass that very easily. And then when looking at the fourth quarter guidance, they're expecting anywhere from 6,700 to 7,000 ES8s in that quarter, and that should be a quarter over quarter increase of around 100%. And revenue should also be pretty strong, coming in at around 100% increase as well. So guidance looking very strong overall. And I want to touch on that a little bit because I was reading some bearish comments on this, and I was looking at like stock twits and things like that, and I was seeing a lot of bears talking about NIO, and they were saying things like that this is a pretty bad quarter, that they're losing money, production is low. And I'm sitting here and I'm thinking, wait a minute, this is a company that was just barely founded, like a few years ago, I think back in 2014. They just barely went public a couple months ago in September. They barely started selling their commercial vehicle to the public, their ES8 SUV, back in June. So this is really the second half of 2018. This is like the first 6 months of actual operation for this company, like the very first 6 months. And they're already expecting NIO to be profitable and to be at capacity, similar to Tesla and things like that. And I just think it's ridiculous. I think they're actually doing very well for it being the very first 6 months of their operations. In fact, most bears want to compare NIO to Tesla right now. They don't want to compare it to Tesla of the past. When Tesla first started, when they had essentially their first 6 months of sales, they want to compare it to Tesla right now. And if you do that, it's just not fair, because NIO only produced around 4,000 this last quarter, 4,000 vehicles. Tesla produced over 80,000. It's just not a fair comparison. Tesla is a much bigger company with much higher capacity because they've been doing it for years. But if you look at Tesla in their first 6 months of really selling their cars, when looking at the first 6 months of selling their Model S, which by a very weird coincidence happens to also be on a June, but this is back in 2012. Tesla only delivered 2,600 Model S's, whereas NIO is likely to hit over 10,000. Now, to be fair, the electric vehicle market was much smaller back then, and the technology was still kind of being developed and things like that. So I can understand that it's a different situation. I can understand that Tesla probably had much greater market share back then. There was much less competition. I understand all those points, but I'm just saying that, comparing NIO to Tesla right now is not fair. You look back at Tesla when they first started, and NIO is actually kind of on fire. Like, they're actually doing pretty well. 2,600 for Tesla versus 10,000 for NIO. But probably the biggest argument that I hear from bears is the whole profitability argument, which I think is one of the most ridiculous arguments out there. I don't know how they expect a company to just come up out of nowhere and instantly be profitable. It's just not the way the world works. It takes a lot of time to become profitable. Tesla barely started becoming profitable recently, and nobody wants to talk about that. But to be fair, NIO is losing money per vehicle, and I do think that that's a fair argument. But the good news is that they are improving. In fact, I got these numbers from an article I was reading earlier, and it said that the ES8's average price was $69,000 in the second quarter, but dropped to $65,000 in the third quarter. I'm not really sure why that would be, but what the interesting part about this is that the average profit per unit improved from negative $213,000 in Q2 to just negative $2,700 in Q3. So the profit per unit is at least improving. It'll probably get better as we continue to ramp up production. There's going to be a lot of early costs right now that are going to hurt margins and are going to hurt profitability, but that should improve by the next quarter. So I'm expecting Q4, maybe we start to see the ES8 actually producing a profit. And then I think all the real profit will actually come from their 5-seater SUV, which is the ES6, and that one is set to cost around half the price of the ES8, so it'll be much more accessible to the public, and it's already on track to be launched by the end of this year. So in conclusion, is NIO burning cash? Yes, they are. If you want to think of it as burning cash, you absolutely can, and I respect your opinion on that. I like to think of it as investing in their future. But sure, they are going through a lot of cash, and they're not are they profitable? No, they're absolutely not profitable. It's probably going to take a very long time until they become profitable, until they get everything up and running. Are they losing money per unit sold? Yeah, they're still kind of losing money for their ES8s, but that should probably improve in the next quarter. But here's some other points. This was essentially their very first quarter in terms of operations, and they are already manufacturing and selling vehicles in the thousands, obviously being contracted through Jack Motors, but still. And they're probably going to see those numbers grow by over 100% just by next quarter, including revenue. We should also see that grow by over 100% next quarter, which is really good growth. And we'll probably see a lot of these short-term expenses not being recurring. So that will also help in terms of their margins and in terms of their operating losses and things like that going forward. So I'm going to make a couple predictions, and this is just my opinion, so I could absolutely be wrong. But I think that we will absolutely crush the 10,000 unit sales by the end of the year. I think that the ES8 will actually become a profitable vehicle going forward. So by next quarter, as we work through the economies of scale and we ramp up production and sell more ES8s, I think it will actually become profitable. And then I think that the ES6 is going to be their most important vehicle in their lineup. And I think it's going to really drive the company forward a lot more once it's actually launched and is available to the public. Because again, being priced at around half the price of the ES8, I think it's much more accessible. And I kind of see it as like the Model 3 of Tesla. I kind of see that as like the Model 3 for NIO. But I also think that a lot of these things will take time, and I'm completely fine with that. I have nothing but time. And I look at NIO as a very small, speculative, long-term investment, so I can absolutely wait for it to take off maybe decades from now, years from now, or decades from now. And if I'm wrong and I lose my money in NIO, that's no big deal. It was a very small position in my portfolio. But who cares what I think? It matters what you guys think. So make sure you leave me a comment down below. Let me know how you feel. Do you agree with me? Do you disagree with me? What do you think is going to happen going forward? Do you think that Tesla and NIO can coexist? I kind of feel like Tesla is running unchecked right now, so I see no reason why we can't have some healthy competition coming out of China. But, I know that there's also a lot of competition in China. I just think that NIO is one of the best funded and most backed electric vehicle companies out there. So I kind of have high hopes for NIO in the long term. But let me know what you guys think. I'd love to hear all about it. Make sure you hit the like button if you enjoyed this video. And to support the channel, make sure you subscribe. Thank you for watching, and I hope you all have a wonderful, beautiful day and that you take care. Bye-bye.